be opening your Bibles to the 8th chapter of the book of Daniel. There are sometimes lessons that I wonder why I'm even teaching, and I guess Daniel 8 is one of those lessons because it not only gives the dream, but it gives the interpretation at the end, so it's really it's just all right there. You don't really have to think too much about it, but there's a lot of detail involved in this, and especially toward the end of the interpretation of the dream that Daniel has, calls for some historical examination of things that are to come to pass many years after Daniel dies. Just as a brief review, last week we talked about chapter 7. This is called the Scroll of Nabonidus, who was the emperor or the king of Babylon. This is the only reference that we have in a historical setting of Belshazzar. Belshazzar, as you remember, a few chapters back, when the city of Babylon fell to the Medes, he died at the end of that chapter. This is again really the only archaeological evidence of him is written on this. It's a cylinder. It's the cylinder or the cylinder of Nabonidus, and this is his father referring to him as the king of Babylon. As you remember last week when we talked about chapter 7, we talked about who is this? The lion with the wings. This is Nebuchadnezzar. This is Babylon. And while Babylon ruled the world, these are the areas that that encompass their rule. The Babylonians then fell to who? The Medes. All right. This is another rendition of the lion. This is Cyrus, the king of the Medes and the Persians, and we'll be talking some about Cyrus this morning, as he represents one of the images in the 8th chapter. This is Cyrus, and when the Archimedes or the Medo-Persians ruled the world, you can see the expanse of their kingdoms. They ruled until the fall of the Medo-Persian Empire to who? To the Greeks. And so if you were to guess who this was, who would you guess this is? This is Alexander the Great. His father was Philip of Macedon. He was the first king of Greece, and he ruled until his death at the age of 33. I said 29 last week. He died at the age of 33 after conquering most of the known world that were held by the Medes and the Persians. These are the four, upon Alexander's death, these are the four that took his place. We will be interested today in only one of these four, the one at the very end on your, what would that be, your right? Yeah, on your right, on the far right, that's Seleucus. The others are next to Seleucus from right to left is Seleucus, and then the whitish bust is Ptolemy of Egypt. Cassander is the coin, and the one in the middle is Lycanabus, the ruler of Asia Minor. And so the kingdom of Alexander the Great fell to these four men. And these four men, Alexander did not divide the kingdom among these four men. These four men fought each other for the kingdoms, and they eventually overcame one another, with one taking the rule over each of the four segments of the kingdom. And this is how the kingdom sorted out. Ptolemy, of course, was Egypt. One of his descendants was Cleopatra. Seleucus was the one who ruled the area that we're most concerned with, the area of the Middle East. Antigonus and Cassander, like Lysimachus, ruled the other smaller areas. And they were constantly at battle, especially Seleucus and Ptolemy. There was a constant battle for this area in between their two kingdoms, and that area in between the two kingdoms is where the Jews were. This is where Jerusalem is. This is where the Middle East is located primarily. And so these two, but especially Seleucus, is the one that we'll see in today's chapter, will be the one that gives forth to what's called the little horn. And so as we begin, we'll read the 8th chapter, and then we'll go through the interpretation, although the interpretation again is given in the chapter itself. In the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after that which appeared to me at the first. And I saw in the vision, and when I saw, I was in Susa, the citadel. This is the citadel. This is Susa. This is the citadel, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in the vision, and I was at the Eulali canal. I raised my eyes and saw, and behold, a ram standing on the bank of the canal. It had 2 horns, and both horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. I saw the ram charging westward, northward, southward. No beast could stand before him, and there was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. As I was considering, behold, a male goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came to the ram with the 2 horns, which I had seen standing on the bank of the canal, and he ran at him in his powerful wrath. I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him, and struck the ram and broke the 2 horns. And the ram had no power to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him, and there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. Then the goat became exceedingly great. But when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. Out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, and toward the east, and toward the glorious land. It grew great, even to the host of heaven, and some of the host and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. It became great, even as great as the prince of the host, and the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. And a host will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offerings because of transgression, and it will throw truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, "For how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and host to be trampled underfoot?" And he said to me, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state." When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it. Behold, there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, and it called, "Gabriel, make this man to understand the vision." And so he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, "Understand, O Son of Man, that the vision is for the time of the end." And when he had spoken to me, I fell into a deep sleep with my face to the ground. But he touched me and made me to stand up. And he said, "Behold, I will make known to you what shall be the latter end of the indignation, for it refers to the appointed time of the end. As for the ram that you saw with the 2 horns, those are the kings of Media and Persia. And the goat is the great king of Greece, and the great horn between his eyes is the first king. As for the horn that was broken, in place of which 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. And at the latter end of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their limit, a king of bold face, one who understands riddles, shall arise. His power shall be great, but not by his own power. And he shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does, and destroy mighty men and the people who are the saints. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he shall become great. Without warning he will destroy many, and he shall even rise up against the prince of princes, and he shall be broken, but by no human hand. The vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been told is true, but seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. And I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for some days. Then I rose and went about the king's business, but I was appalled by the vision and did not understand it. So the vision takes place in the 3rd year of the king's reign. In the last chapter, when did that vision take place? In the 1st year of Belshazzar. And so we see in the first verse, in the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after that which appeared to me at the first. That's the chapter before. The first vision that he had was the first vision. And so what we see is he is in Shushan, or he is in the other name for this is Shushan, is Susa, is the citadel. The country is of Elam, and the country of Elam is the seat of the future Persian Empire. This is where Cyrus will live. This is where Cyrus will make his decree in Nehemiah that allows the Jews to return to their homeland, to rebuild the walls of the city and to rebuild the temple. And so this is setting the stage for the return under Cyrus. But there are some things that must happen before the advent of that. And so if we look at Shushan, Shushan is located between 2 rivers. And he talks about being on the Ulai Canal. And the Ulai Canal is a canal that runs between the 2 rivers there at Shushan. It was 900 feet wide. And it was the only canal that Cyrus would drink from. He would not drink from either of the 2 rivers. He would only drink from the canal. And so today, this is located obviously in southwestern Iran. It's about 150 miles north of the Persian Gulf, near the city of Kazakhstan. Shushan is mentioned other places in the Bible, if you make note of the fact that it's mentioned in Nehemiah 1:1. It's also mentioned in Esther. And so this city plays an important part in Bible history from the fact that there are many things that take place in this very city. In verse 2, we see that he's standing on the banks of the Ulai Canal in the province of Elam, as we've discussed. Again, this is an artificial canal that was built between the 2 rivers. And Herodotus again tells us that Cyrus would only drink from this canal. He would not drink from the rivers. There is a grand gate at the beginning of the city of Shushan. And interestingly enough, and this is not part of Daniel 8, but this is the gate of Xerxes. And this gate itself is mentioned in Esther 2, verse 19. It's mentioned again in Esther 5, and it's mentioned again in Esther 6. The walls surrounding this gate, and obviously the walls are long since gone, but the walls around this gate were over 50 feet thick. This was an imperial city. It was an imperial capital. And in the 3rd and 4th kingdom of the Medo-Persian Empire, it stood as one of the grand cities and was the city, again, where Cyrus had his rule. So I raised my eyes in verse 3. I raised my eyes and saw, behold, a ram standing on the bank of the canal. Well, if we read down through the interpretation, we know that ram was the Medo-Persian Empire, consisting of 2 kings. And it says in verse 3 that it had 2 horns. Both horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. And the higher one that came up last would be Cyrus. He was the greatest. He was called Cyrus the Great. He was the first of the great Medo-Persian or great Persian emperors. This is a listing just for your informational purposes. These are the kings that ruled during the time, some during the time of Daniel, many after the time of Daniel. So you'll see Xerxes there. He is mentioned in Esther And his name is Ahasuerus. That's the Bible name. He is never called Xerxes. He's always called Ahasuerus. And he ruled during the time when the Jews were returning under Cyrus. There were other kings that returned, but Xerxes is most well known for his defeat by who? Who defeated Xerxes? You remember the great battle of Marathon? Well, it wasn't Alexander, but it was the Greeks. The Greeks defeated the Persians on their first incursion into Greece at the Battle of Marathon. And then his son Xerxes II, which is on down the list, and he's known by another name. There's Artaxerxes. He was the one that invaded Greece and had the famous battle at Thermopylae, at the Narrows, where the Spartans fought the Persians there. So this is a listing, and you'll notice that it ends with Alexander the Great. And so what we see is we see this great ram, and it's making inroads to the east and to the north and to the south. It makes inroads to the west, to the north, and to the south. So you would see as the kingdom would come along, you would see these incursions made to the north, made to the west, and to the south, and of course south being Egypt and the others being over into those areas. And no beast could stand before him. There was no one that could stand before the Medo-Persian Empire at the zenith of its power. There was no one who could rescue from the power, and he did as he pleased and became great. And so at the height of the Medo-Persian Empire, in verse 5 we read, "As I was considering, behold, a male goat came from the west." Now it's interesting to note that the Medo-Persians many times wore a ram's helmet, a ram stylized helmet on their heads as they fought. So a ram is very indicative of the Medo-Persians, just as the he-goat, the Greeks were called the goat people. This is very indicative of the Greeks. And so what we see is this goat appears, a male goat in verse 5, came from the west, so he would come from the west, across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. And he had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came to the ram with the two horns, which I had seen standing on the bank of the canal, and he ran at him in his powerful wrath. So when the Greeks moved, when Alexander comes to the beginnings of his kingdom 150 years after Cyrus, and that was from 336 BC to 323 BC. He was dead at 33, and that's mentioned in verse 8. The goat became exceedingly great, Alexander the Great, became exceedingly great, but when he was strong, their great horn was broken. This indicates that the great horn was broken. This person died. It was broken, and instead of it, there came up four conspicuous horns toward the four winds of heaven. So we have Cyrus the Great. So this is Cyrus the Great. This is a bust of Cyrus the Great in the Berlin Museum. And then we have Alexander the Great. And what happened under Cyrus? What was the edict of Cyrus? If you read the book of Nehemiah, what happened under Cyrus to the children of Israel? They were repatriated back to the land under Zerubbabel, under other great men who were sent back to rebuild the walls of the city, to rebuild the city of Jerusalem, to rebuild the temple, to rebuild all these things. Cyrus was the beginning, and Cyrus is called one of God's own because God chose him and even gave him a vision of what he was to do. So Cyrus, while not a Jew, was a great man in that he allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem. And so after him came Alexander the Great. Again, the kingdom was divided at Alexander's death in 323 BC. He died at the age of 33. And his kingdom was divided into the four that we saw earlier, but we're only going to focus on the one. So the goat became exceedingly great, verse 8. The great horn was broken, Alexander dies. And instead of him there came up the four horns conspicuous toward the four winds of heaven. Now out of one of those four came a little horn. And so the majority of the 8th chapter focuses on, starting in verse 9, all the way through the end of the chapter, focuses on that little horn. And that little horn is Antiochus Epiphanes. Who's heard of Antiochus Epiphanes? Anybody? He's probably one of the cruelest men who's ever walked the face of the earth. As we know, the Greek Empire rose and covered the whole earth that was known at that time. It rose from the west, just as the verse said. And so this little horn grows exceedingly great toward the south and toward the east and toward the glorious land. And we see the glorious land here is the land of at that time the land of Palestine, where Jerusalem is. So that would be the glorious land. He grew great, even to the host of heaven, and some of the host and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. And this brings us to the exceeding cruelty that Antiochus visited on the Jews in Jerusalem. If you're not familiar with that, I have some quotes. Antiochus, at the end of all these things, would be responsible for what's called the Maccabean Revolt. And the book of Maccabees, while it's not an inspired book, is a book that talks about this period in time. Antiochus was an infamous persecutor of the Jewish people. His main goal was to get them to submit to Greek culture. It was to get them to submit to Greek customs. He was willing to use anything, including murder and violence on the people, to achieve his end. His suppression of the Jews came to a head in December. In fact, it was December 25th of 168 BC, when he returned from a defeat at the hands of Ptolemy in Alexandria. He ordered his soldiers to secure the city of Jerusalem. They seized the city, and they began an unholy desecration of not only the city itself, but the people and the temple. He went into the temple and tore down all of the sacraments that were in the temple. He put out the candle that was to burn forever. He set up an idol of Zeus. He desecrated the altar where the sacrifices were made by the Jews. He desecrated the altar by offering up a swine. He butchered a pig on the altar. He sprinkled the blood from the pig all through the sanctuary. He forced the priest to drink a watered down solution of the pig's blood. In the book of Maccabees, it describes how he persecuted the Jews, and it further describes all of the blasphemies that he did. By some estimates, he's responsible for more than 100,000 Jews being murdered when he seized the city. I just highlighted a couple of things here. I won't read the whole of this text. But after 2 years fully expired, the king sent his chief collector of tribute to the cities of Judah, who came to Jerusalem with a great multitude, and they spake peaceable words unto them, but with all deceit. For when they had given them credence, he fell suddenly on the city and smote it very sore, and destroyed much people of Israel. When he had taken the spoils of the city, he set it on fire, and pulled down the houses and the walls thereof on every side. He took women and children captive. He made a commandment there would be put to death certain women that had caused their children to be circumcised. They hanged the infants by their necks and rifled their houses and threw all those who had been circumcised. Moreover, Antiochus wrote that the whole kingdom should be one people, and they should leave their laws and embrace the Greek law. He sent letters by messengers to Jerusalem, to the cities of Judah, that they should not follow the strange laws of their land, and offer burnt offerings and sacrifice, and drink offerings in the temple of Zeus. That they should profane the Sabbath and the festival days, and pollute the sanctuary, and set up altars and groves and chapels of idols, and sacrifice swine's flesh and unclean beasts. He was not a good person. The terrors of Antiochus are detailed in this rendering in Daniel 8. He became great, as great even as the prince of the host. In case the prince of the host would have been the high priest at the time, whose name was Omus III. Omus III and Antiochus had a very turbulent relationship. There are a lot of things that were going on in the background. There were bribes to make another priest the high priest. So there's a lot to it. We could spend hours talking about all of the intrigue that went on during this period in time. But suffice to say, the prince of the host was this high priest, Omar III. And so the regular burnt offerings was taken away. We talked about that. The place of the sanctuary was overthrown. The temple was destroyed. And the host will be given over to it, verse 12, together with the regular burnt offerings because of transgressions. It will throw truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper. And so after all of these horrific things that would happen, and if you go back up to verse 10, some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. The host of heaven here, your version may say, obviously were the Jewish people. So they were thrown to the ground and trampled by this man. And the host was given over, and again, the burnt offerings and the transgression, the burnt offerings were suspended. And in verse 13, Daniel says, "And I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to me, for how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and host to be trampled underfoot?" So the question of the duration of the sanctuary desecration is an area of, as you might imagine, quite a bit of controversy. But I think if we follow the Bible and we look at the history, we can see that this duration. So this Holy One who speaks, we don't know who he is, other than we see Gabriel's name mentioned in there, mentioned down in I think verse 16 or 17. So the question comes up: how long? How long will this desecration go on? What is the duration of this? And so the answer is given in verse 14. Then he said to me, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary will be restored to its rightful state. So let's examine let's look at just really quickly the various things. So if we look at 2,300 days could mean, if there's an evening and a morning, because remember in creation, in Genesis, the evening and the morning were one day. And so if we take that 2,300 as 2,300 days, we split that in half. If there's two being done, morning and evening, that would be 1,150 days. Refers to the time that the actual temple was desecrated. Well, that doesn't really fit in. That's a little less than 3 years. And this, in fact, was the time of the Maccabean tribulation, at the end of which the sanctuary was cleansed. So it's possible that 2,300 days means 2,300 actual days, and from that date, December 25th of the year when it started, the desecration started, to the date when the temple was cleansed was again in 165. If we count back 2,300 days from that, we come to the very year when Antiochus began his persecution in earnest. That is probably the best description by conservative scholars. Now, this passage has also been a favorite springboard of elaborate and fanciful prophetic interpretations. So a popular yet tragic interpretation of this passage is that it took 1 year for every day, which it doesn't say. It says 2,300 days, it doesn't say 2,300 years. But there has been an interpretation that this 2,300 refers to 2,300 days. And if you do the math on the 2,300 days, to calculate that, there is a religious group who believes that 2,300 years from the date of this would be the date that Christ returns. And so he would have returned in 1844. And do you know what religious body that is that practices that today, that believes he returned in 1844? Do you know? The Seventh-day Adventists. The Seventh-day Adventists believe that Jesus returned in 1844, based on this 2,300 years. It doesn't say 2,300 years, it says 2,300 days. And so the 2,300 days probably most likely represents the period in time when the temple would be cleansed, it would be returned to its sanctuary status for the Jewish people. And so there are several others that have comments on this. The amazingly specific prophecy of the 2,300 days from the time when he desecrated the temple, when Antiochus desecrated the temple, to the time when it was renewed is actually 2,300 days. I think it's about 7 years. I think it's what I wrote down in my notes somewhere. So, the interpretation of the vision. So the interpretation really tells the story. We don't have to talk much about the interpretation because the interpretation is right here in the chapter. Daniel doesn't understand he doesn't understand it. He sought to understand. Behold, there was standing before me. He had the appearance of a man. He's standing on the banks of the canal, and Gabriel comes and makes this man understand the vision. So he came near where I stood. I fell on my face. And he said to me, understand, O son of man. So he is referred to, Daniel is referred to as, O son of man, lowercase letters, not uppercase, son of man, that the vision is for a time of the end. When he had spoken to me, I fell into a deep sleep with my face on the ground, but he touched me and made me to stand up. So behold, I will make known to you the latter end of the indignation, for it refers to the appointed time of the end, that 2,300 days. As the ram that you saw, the two horns, there are the kings of Media and Persia. So we had already determined that, but Daniel 8 makes it very clear that that's who this is. And notice that one horn is greater than the other, as it said in the early verses there. The ram with the two horns, the kings of Media and Persia. The king of Persia obviously is greater, so that horn came up last. And so that's why that's stated that way. The goat is the king of Greece. That's Alexander the Great. And the great horn between his eyes is the first king. That's Alexander the Great. And so when the horn was broken, when Alexander died, the transgressors, the four kingdoms shall arise from this nation, but not with his power. They did not have his power because there was constant infighting among the four of them to try and gain the land of the other. His power shall be great. At the latter end, verse 23, at the latter end of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their limit, a king of bold face, one who understands riddles, shall arise. And that is Antiochus, who you see on the screen. His power shall be great, but not by his own power, for he shall make fearful destruction and shall succeed in what he does, and destroy mighty men and the people who are the saints. In other words, he's going to take this out on the Jewish people by his cunning. And one of the things he was known for was he was extremely cunning and very deceitful. He shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own hand he shall become great. Without warning he shall destroy many, and he shall even rise up against the prince of princes. Again, that is the high priest, and he shall be broken, but by no human hand. The vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been told is true, but seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. And so the vision that Daniel has is to be sealed up. It's not anything that's going to happen. And in point of fact, it does not happen for many hundreds of years after Daniel dies. So we look back at Antiochus, and there's one. I believe I have this is another bust of. Oh, this was Seleucus. I'm sorry. This is Seleucus. This is the one of the four that arose. So from Seleucus came the little horn, which was Antiochus. This is Antiochus Epiphanes. And the Jews had another name for him. They called him Antiochus Epimanes, which means the madman. And so while he was called Antiochus Epiphanes, which Epiphanes is the Greek for manifest God. He was the manifest God. In fact, on a coin, as you can see, there's an inscription on the right side of the coin, and that's a female deity sitting on the throne. The inscription says Antiochus, manifest God. And so while the Jews called him the madman, Epimanes, the Greeks called him the manifest God. Right, and that was Hanukkah. Yes, that's that. Yeah, out of all of this came the Maccabean Revolution. And obviously, none of this is in the Bible. This is merely history. Out of this came the Maccabean Revolution, when the brothers Maccabee, rose and revolted against the Greeks, and they revolted, and there was a feast of dedication that was set up after this, and we know it is. Right, in the Feast of Dedication, yeah. And this is the feast we know of as Hanukkah. Yeah, the 8 days. So there's a lot of this written up that's in history that is not recorded in the Bible, but it's important to understand that the books of the Bible are not in a chronological order. There are some that are taking place early on, and then you have to go back to Nehemiah. You have to go back to Ezra. You have to go back to those when the Jews are released by Cyrus the Great to return to the Judean homeland, to begin the process of rebuilding the city and rebuilding the walls. It was sealed up in 820. In verse 26, it says it would be sealed up. What became of Antiochus? Let's just say he died a horrible death. He was stricken, and those who were near him or around him from around the time of his death said that this must have been something that came down from the gods, because he died of disease, but not by the hand of man. There are some who would refer to him as the Antichrist, and you get off into a whole conversation about Antichrist and what Antichrist is. What is the Antichrist? We read about the Antichrist in Revelation. What is the Antichrist? What is Antichrist? Is it one person? No. Antichrist is not one person. Antichrist is anyone who arises and preaches against the gospel of Jesus, the gospel that you read about in the Bible. Anybody that arises and preaches a different gospel than this, that the one has been delivered, is Antichrist. Okay? So there's no one person that's Antichrist. Don't believe that. I was actually in a class where I was teaching Revelation one time, and there was a gentleman in the class who just knew that the eagle in Revelation represented the United States. And I'm like, what good would that do those people in that time? This book was written to those people who were enduring suffering. So many comparatives that people have made between Daniel 8 and the book of Revelation. This is just not the case. Daniel was shown a vision of something that would come to pass many years after he died, and he took us, just as we will see in chapter 11. If when you swing over and we get to chapter 11, there's going to be kings of the north and kings of the south, and who are they talking about there? And so again, this is bringing the historical record in parallel with the Bible to look at this. So we have a man who arises as a little horn. He wears out the saints. Those are the faithful Jews in verse 24. He'll destroy mighty men and the people who are the saints. And we have carefully recorded records from Herodotus and others who tell us about the great tribulation that Antiochus laid siege to the city of Jerusalem and the province of Judea. He was broken without hand. In other words, he died a horrible death, but it was not by any man's hand. It was by the hand of some invisible force. But he was stricken with some maladies, and he was literally eaten alive by worms. So his end was not a good one. So, as we conclude this chapter and we look back at this prophetic interpretation of what will come in the years to come after Daniel's death, there are probably three good lessons that we can glean from this chapter. Galatians 6:16 and other verses in the Bible talk about God's people being in tribulation. All who live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. There are various forms of persecution that these people suffered in those days, much more horrific than what we suffer today. But we do suffer persecution, do we not? When people call us various names, they deride us for being flat earthers. They deride us for being Christians. They deride us for things. So God's people will always suffer persecution. I guess the second lesson that we learn is that there are those today who will persecute us as though we are in captivity, and that there are causes for that captivity. And Daniel was moved by the suffering of others. Daniel, as you read the last verse of this, Daniel was overcome, and he lay sick for many days. But then, even though he was moved by the suffering of others and this suffering that was to come, as a son of man, he was also moved by the emotions of his fellow man. And he also understood his responsibility to the king. Not only was he a servant, first of all, to God, but in a secondary sense, he was a servant of the king. And that's illustrated very well in verse 27 when he says, I arose, and went about the king's business. But nonetheless, he was appalled by the vision. He was appalled by the fact that his fellow Jews would be released to go back and to rebuild a city, although he did not know that at the time. It's very possible, though, under Cyrus's leadership, that Daniel was still alive. He would have been a very old man. But he could have actually been witness to the Jews being released back to their homeland to start to rebuild the city. So Daniel was always moved by the suffering of others, and I think that's a real lesson for us as we go out into the world, that we're a product of our emotions. We're a product of the teachings of Jesus. We're all to be sympathetic to the sufferings of others and to work in a way, as Daniel did, to try and alleviate those things. But sometimes the sufferings of men are such that we too are appalled and lay sick in our beds. Comments or questions about anything in Daniel 8? Anything at all? I think that's the last. I think that was the last. Yep, that's the last slide. So, yes, sir. Go ahead.
We've had people in the Brotherhood, they take that 2300 and make a year, come up to 1830, and say restoration.
Yeah, that was not one of the ones that I saw a mention of that for the restoration period. But yeah, that's another, and it just obviously does not fit the model, because the 2300 days was exactly the period in time when the destruction of the temple occurred, or the desecration of the temple occurred, and then the restoration of the temple at the end of the Maccabean Revolution. Does Jesus mention the abomination of desolation? Does he ever mention that in the Bible? Does he ever mention that in the New Testament? Yes, he does. He mentions the abomination of desolation. What's that in reference to? When he mentions that, what's that in reference to? Do you remember? It's in Matthew 24. Talks about the abomination of desolation. That's in regard to Titus's destruction of Jerusalem when the Jewish nation was destroyed. But there were no Christians destroyed when that happened, because the Christians had Jesus' warning, and when they were told, they fled the city. There were no Jews killed when Titus came into the city. There were no Jews killed. And this was a time when the persecution of the Jewish people was so great that they ran out of wood, because they were making the Romans were making so many crosses to crucify people on, that they ran out of wood. They didn't have enough wood to kill all the people that were there. 800,000 or 1.2 million Jews killed when Titus and the Romans took the city of Jerusalem. And so when Jesus spoke about the abomination of desolation, he was talking about the city of Jerusalem being totally destroyed, not just the temple, but the total city. Comments or questions? Anybody else? Anybody? Okay. AD 70, yes it was, yeah. Yeah. And that's chapters 24 and 25 of Matthew have been the most misinterpreted by men down through the years as probably any other chapters. So next week, Daniel chapter 9. Now we're going to talk about the 70 weeks. And you want to talk about controversy. I'm still in the middle of reading a volume of stuff. That's a stack of stuff on the 70 weeks to look at all the interpretations. So next week, Daniel 9, good Lord willing, we'll discuss Daniel 9 and the 70 weeks. We hope you can be here then. Thank you.